welcome to the meeting. Welcome to the meeting. We will be popping this onto our website and our YouTube site so that others who are unable to join this evening will be able to join. So having completed our acknowledgement of country, I want to introduce our first speaker this evening, Rebecca Warner, who recently joined Palladium as Director of APAC. Rebecca's got 20 years of experience working in international development, foreign affairs and international security, including with DFAT, Department of Defence and the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations. Rebecca served as advisor to Australia's Minister for Foreign Affairs and as a senior advisor to the Minister for International Development and the Pacific. And she's helped to steer the government's strategy and policy development for Australia's engagement in the Pacific and international development response to COVID-19. And she's supported ministers in high-level meetings with leaders from the APAC region. Rebecca has previously been posted by the Australian government to PNG and Kenya and with the UN peacekeeping mission in South Sudan. So a fantastic speaker to start us off this evening. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'd also like to just acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional owners of the land where I'm joining from this evening in Canberra. I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and connections to land, water and community. I think it's true to say that everybody in the development community has resoundingly welcomed the new international development policy of the governments. You know, I think there's some continuity. It builds on previous approaches and trends in development, but I think there's a genuine way in which this policy marks a change from policies of the past. You know, I've attended a couple of fora, including, you know, ones at which the Minister for International Development and the Pacific, Minister Conroy, have spoken at, and senior people from DFAT. And it's very clear that this policy's big point of difference is in emphasising that how development programs are delivered is as important as what those programs do. So you know, you'll sort of see some areas and things that the development policy wants to achieve reflected in the policy, but it's left open deliberately and doesn't focus on particular sectors. And that's because of that point that Chris drew on at the outset, that this is really about genuine partnerships based on respect, listening and learning from each other. So we're fairly used to policies and approaches that are very much based on that bilateral relationship between governments that in which, you know, where we respond as Australian development partners to partner governments' wishes. But I think this policy differs in terms of going a lot deeper and also a lot broader in terms of how it envisages local participation. So there is a really, I think one of the really headline things in this policy that's different from previous approaches, or at least it builds quite significantly on things that we've been doing in recent years, is this commitment to maximise local participation. That involves building capacity and transferring skills, maximising jobs and economic opportunities within the development program. I think Minister Conroy talked about providing a double dividend for partner countries, so they get, you know, both the benefits of the program and also the benefits for those that participate in delivering. But there's also this commitment to build capacity within local organisations, and including through providing funding to enable their greater participation over time. So this is very much about building up those local organisations. And there's also been mention about the involvement of local organisations in designing, implementing and monitoring of programs. So I think all of this kind of adds up to a really significant change in terms of how programs. It would be remiss of me if I didn't also mention that other aspects of how we go about delivering programs that are really highlighted in the policy. And one of them, of course, is really integrating climate mitigation and adaptation into the program through, a new commitment to at least 50% of all new bilateral and regional investments having a climate change objective by 24-25, and then 80% goal or target by 28-29, and also the strong commitment to have to gender equality and to having a target of 80% of all development investments over 3 million, including gender equality objectives. And then the other aspect of this that I wanted to sort of flag in terms of how we go about delivering development expertise is drawing on Australia's strengths. And one of those strengths, I think, is our leadership in terms of advancing disability equity and rights. But another really significant new part of this policy is embedding the commitment or the objective of embedding the perspectives and experiences of First Nations Australians into the development program and drawing on their knowledge, including through the work of Australia's Ambassador for First Nations people, who's been appointed by this government. Another part of the policy to mention is the new approach to performance and monitoring and evaluation. I won't sort of talk about the whole framework that sort of accompanies the policy. What I really wanted to say is that the discussions around it that I've been part of with people from DFAT really show that what they're aiming for is an approach where we're measuring in real time what's working and what's not, and involving local partners and then adjusting as we go. So I think it all adds up. I think it's important to sort of think about that and think not just about the letter of the policy, but really what is DFAT and what is the Australian government aiming at with all of this. And I personally think that there's a real opportunity and an intention to change the way we plan, design and implement our development programs. This isn't just about enabling local actors and local players to become DFAT suppliers and reorienting their focus, which actually would involve reorienting their focus to DFAT as the client, which might actually be an unintended consequence. I think what this is really aiming at is reorienting our programs so that the local actors and their knowledge and their experience and their objectives when it comes to development are at the centre, so that in fact they are the clients. Or sort of increasingly seen as the clients, as well as the participants in our programs. So the way I'm thinking of it is that if we think about the development work that we do as involving, or development per se, not even just the development we do, is involving ecosystems, government service providers or infrastructure, commissioners, local businesses, community organisations, women's groups, disability advocates and persons with disability, communities struggling with climate change and coming up with ideas for how they can make themselves more resilient. This is about supporting all those local actors to sort of play their part within these development ecosystems through our programs to achieve things that they want to achieve in their own country contexts. So I think really this focus on localization is about sustainable, locally driven solutions. And it's exciting, actually. I can see in Palladium and the wider sort of development community that we participate in a real enthusiasm and excitement about this and what it might mean for how we do things, leading to some really creative new ways of thinking about our development programs that we're involved in. So thank you, Chris, and I'm looking forward to hearing what AJ and Wayne have to say about the policy.
So a quick question before we move on to AJ, just in terms of your work at Palladium focusing on APAC, how do you see that changing? Do you have a picture of how it will change yet? Or are you just starting to dive into this policy and working out how programs might pivot a little from how they have been in the past?
Well, I think let's look at the work at Palladium that I'm involved in, and one part of the work of directors is to sort of oversee existing programs and serve as the interface between DFAT and programs. And I think that there'll be as the opportunity comes around, there'll be a real opportunity for those team leaders and teams that are implementing programs to think about ways they can integrate climate change, but in terms of the localization agenda, build up the capacity of local partners as gender in the gender equality space, in the disability space, but across all sort of aspects. I think there's also a really big opportunity there as we look at the designs that DFAT produces and the tender processes that we're involved in, to think about how we can take the DFAT's objectives in the new international development policy and make them give expression to those and think about really implementing those in the spirit as well as the letter of what DFAT has to say. So coming up with our own ideas for how we can involve local partners more in what we do. And I'll be honest, there's some challenge and to some extent there's a perception at least that there's there may be a trade-off between some local organisations may not have the capacity, and they certainly don't have the capacity to do DFAT, meet DFAT's requirements. And I think we need to, as I was trying to sort of intimate before, avoid the hazard of just simply building up local partners to meet DFAT's requirements. Yeah. I think we have to find ways that we can involve those local partners to play their role in their national systems and ecosystems. But I think, when I look at the people in Palladium, I see a huge amount of expertise and I don't just mean in Palladium, in the sector generally, and a genuine commitment to wanting to do our best and beyond that. So I think I really think that there could be some really exciting things. In fact, I think we've seen a bit of that in some pockets. To take a program that Palladium isn't involved in, the approach to supporting Pacific women's organisations over the last decade or so has actually led to some real capacity being built in those organisations, not to do what DFAT wants per se, though there's that, but actually to get involved in advocating within their countries, in their country contexts, or within the business community, within private sector, to government, for policy changes. And then, for DFAT and for those of us that are contracted by DFAT, that enables us to get behind a government's policies that reflect those innovative ideas that are coming from, the women's organisations within country. So I think there's work being done. I can see it in the programs that Palladium runs. I just didn't want to be too corporate about what I do, but really interesting stuff in our market development facility that's working with the local parts of, economic systems in countries, and sort of identifying where there's incentives for change and really leveraging those, or even supporting the people that want to drive those changes. That's the type of type of approach I think we'll see a lot more of, and becoming the norm rather than, the exception or something additional to what we do.
Great, thank you very much. That's really interesting. Really interesting. Okay, we'll move on to AJ, or Anthony Carrigan, currently CEO of Kymea Foundation, which has active programs and partnerships globally and core offices in Ethiopia, Mozambique, Malawi, and PNG, but partnerships in over 20 countries around the world. An ACFID partner in DFAT and Trade Australian NGO Cooperation Program that works to improve the health and prosperity of marginalised communities and their environments. Prior to being CEO of Kymea, Anthony was the director with a large managing contractor, working with most major donors around the world since 2006, served as CEO of a managing contractor business in India, and has led the Indo-Pacific project management community of practice and initiatives to draft and register modern slavery statements, reconciliation action plans, and achieve ISO 9001 project management certification. He's an assessor on community grants program globally, providing small-scale grants for developing communities. So welcome, AJ. It's really good to have you here too. And over to you.
Thanks, Chris. I wasn't sure you were talking about me there for a second, but yeah, I think that I did do a bit of that. Look, to start with, I'm normally on the disputed lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people, but tonight I'm at my sister's place in Canberra on the beautiful lands of the Ngunnawal people, and I offer my respects to their elders, past and present, and I look forward to our Kyeema's continuing journey of reconciliation. Look, I also wanted to say once again, thanks to Chris for inviting Kyeema to speak. I am in fact filling in for one of my team members, Eliza Smith, who was then also filling in for Celia Grenning. But I'm very happy and proud to be a fairly rare bird. Wayne and I, as men on the WIAD panels, I think we're in the inaugural panel in Brisbane, and really happy to see the organisation flourishing and going well. I've got a couple of notes around the policy, and talking to Chris before, I'm going to touch a little bit on the ACFID, the Australian Council for International Development view on it. I was initially going to talk about the bits that we agreed with, but I'll talk about all the other bits as well. I should note that I've also just come off 2 days of the Australian NGO cooperation program that Kyeema is a part of with DFAT, which did include a session on the new development policy yesterday. So I thought a good reflection out of that might be just to point out a few of the areas that room that included, 69 or 59 NGOs that work with DFAT on the ANCP program. Some of the tough bits that they're all wrestling with out of the policy, and that they see as being the tough bits. But before all of that, I just wanted to very quickly reflect on the policy development process, because I always think back to that scene from The Hollow Men where they talk about policy on the run being policy underdone, picking up on some of Rebecca's excellent comments around the consultation. I've actually been pretty impressed, just quietly, with DFAT's process for development of this. I know, for those of us who have been around the sector for a little while, that, and particularly for me coming from NGO land, that we happen to know that Minister Wong is pretty keen on a lot of the elements of this policy and walks the talk on it a fair bit, which is it's really positive for me. And I've worked in government implementing policies that everyone particularly disliked. So it's actually nice being consulted and discussing a policy that people are actually excited about. And I think, Rebecca, you're spot on. That there's actually a fair bit of excitement about it. There's always cynicism about new policies or some changes coming down from a government. But in this case, I think it's healthy to suspend the cynicism a little bit and just focus on the opportunity that the change in policy brings for us. So a little bit of kudos to DFAT on that process. There is a bit of a case of, you get out what you put in, and we certainly had opportunities to make submissions and talk to them about the policy and actually have pretty sophisticated dialogue. It wasn't just we'll sit there and take some notes and that sort of thing. There was actually discussion. In that same vein, just to borrow some of the work or to highlight some of the work of ACFID in relation to the new policy, and I would commend anyone that has access to it. I think it's pretty well public to have a look at the ACFID New Development Policy Analysis, and just to quickly run through. So the things that they applauded, that coincidentally are things that we agreed with, were the announcement of a new civil societies partnerships fund. There was certainly a lot of probing over the last 2 days about what that actually means and what constitutes civil society. But in any case, the announcement of that fund is actually putting, as I said, a bit of talk behind the walk. So we're keen on seeing how that plays out. I think changing on the humanitarian strategy, there has been a lot of fantastic work done in humanitarian activity, and we've all seen different focuses come out of COVID and different views on preparation and resilience. ACFID are applauding that public-facing strategy on the humanitarian program, and I'm interested to see. Well, I think we're all interested to see how that's operationalised. But certainly the rhetoric is pretty good. The introduction of the new target for programs over $3 million to achieve a climate change objective, I think is great. We at CAIMA we've been working in sort of small scale regenerative agriculture and alternative livelihoods for about 20 years. But what we noticed a couple of years ago and what we pivoted towards was that the impact of climate change, particularly on coastal communities in the Pacific, that sort of thing, it's shot to the top of the impact on their day-to-day lives. So seeing the Australian development policy, I won't say catch up with that. That's a bit, but I think it's going to be an important and useful thing to put in those climate objectives. And Rebecca, as you said, I think it'll actually help smart people get their thinking caps on and say, what, maybe we need to look at what we've been doing pretty consistently for the last X number of years and add something a little bit challenging to it. They also welcome the emphasis on the SDGs, on the Sustainable Development Goals. For a lot of us, that's been a no-brainer for a while. So the things that ACFID pointed out that need more work, and I think these were borne out by discussions over the last couple of days, and I'll probably add a bit to those later, was acknowledging the unique needs of children, young people, and LGBTQIA plus people. This is it's always been a vexed area in a lot of development programming and policy, and I think the government recognises that there's more work to be done around that, as does ACFID. Similarly, and we agree with this. I mean, we're in tune with this comment as well. They felt the policy lacked a bit of a whole of world approach, in that it is Indo-Pacific kind of focused, and you would expect that from from DFAT to an extent, or from the Australian government to an extent, but we kind of agree with ACFID in that advocation for something that prioritises need over geography is pretty good and important. And that said, of course, similarly, we've pivoted to do more work in the Pacific over the last couple of years ourselves. The next one that ACFID felt needed more work was tangible commitments on how the development program will lift people out of poverty. So, at CAIMA, we work, in our core work over the last 20 years, is almost not being lifting people out of poverty, it's lifting people out of malnutrition, and then, taking a step towards lifting out of poverty. So there is, I think ACFID's comment on there that there is more work to be done on tangible commitments for lifting people out of poverty is a good one. They also noted a couple of areas that they're really looking forward to, and that's actions around increasing transparency. I know Pat Conroy and Minister Wong have talked about the increased need for transparency, and I think they've got a couple of new. There's a new online portal that is going to be publicly accessible, and a few other things, which is increasing transparency in these programs. I've always felt and I don't think anyone would argue, it's a good thing. The next point that ACFID talked about was the creation of the new development partnership plans, and I don't know if others have been in a couple of those consultations. I love it. I love the idea. I think, Rebecca, you pointed out really well that what we're looking at now is asking what you want, not how can you conform to what DFAT wants or what the Australian government wants. And I think the DPPs are a good way of doing that. They're a great step in the right direction. I'm sure, as in any consultative process, we will have said we could do more or we could do differently. But I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. Then the last point is that ACFID brought out they're looking forward to is increased capability within DFAT and dedicated senior responsible officers at overseas posts. Yeah, I mean, I don't really have a lot of commentary on that. I've certainly worked with a lot of very experienced and knowledgeable folks at DFAT. But any organisation that's looking to build their capability in terms of development, impact, and growth that's a good thing from my perspective as well. So they were the cliff notes on some of the ACFID stuff. And again, I would commend you to read that analysis. Mark and the team have done a good job there. Coming back to the way CAIMA looks at it and what we put into our development policy submission, we are very much a community-focused organisation. We work with very poor and marginalised communities. So we had sort of three what we felt were pretty straightforward submissions around more resilient food systems, around what we refer to as One Health, One Welfare. And then our third was, we termed it localisation through a First Nations lens. And I'm actually pretty comfortable that in varying ways, each of those submissions have actually they've got a bit of purchase in the new policy. I don't think we had we influenced the language particularly, but us coming to it cold and setting out what we thought were important bits, it's actually fairly gratifying to see that those are reflected in parts of the policy. There's still, I mean, the policy actually sets up a lot of challenges, and as a policy should be, it's ambitious. So just, I mean, I'll finish off with a couple of the notes from the ANCP program that I highlight, I think are going to be the tough bits to get out of this policy and to have operationalised. The first one is the localization or locally led development agenda. And sorry, I should make the distinction there, because there's still defining what that means within DFAT, and so that's going to make it very hard, I think, for programming for a little while, and certainly for funding decisions. And one of the things that we've offered DFAT is, if you really want to go with locally led development, you need to take a different lens across the organisation on what's meant by risk sharing and what's meant by an appropriate risk appetite. And that's not diminishing those red line standards, but it's having greater dialogue around it and just being open to let those concepts in the door. The next one was the First Nations perspective on it, and I think there was a danger. What was reflected today was that there was a danger that the Australian government, there was applaud for the First Nations ambassador, but there was also the question that, well, have we really done what we needed to do to sort out the situation in Australia before we can take that to other jurisdictions? And I personally, I'm supportive of it because I think it opens up the dialogue. But there was some consternation in the room about, but how is that going to translate into programming? And then the third one that is particularly an issue of concern for me is that some of the numbers around disability inclusion in the Australian aid program have actually dropped over the last couple of years, and part of that is kind of boosting from COVID numbers, but actually getting disability at leadership and inclusion into programs is tough, and I applaud the fact that they have put that in there. It's going to be a hard one to get results on without sort of sustained effort and willingness to take some risks on funding, because a lot of the organisations involved in that aren't necessarily registered. They're usually coming up through personal experience. They're advocating through personal experience, and they don't always have a whole organisation to back them, so it's harder for them to get funded through programs. So they're probably, I think, the top three tough bits. And Wayne, I know you were dialed into the conference as well. You might have some other views on that. But again, I just come back to the notion and the positivity around the change opportunity that we've got with the new policy and the new implementation, and I saw the same sort of vigour in DFAT in putting this kind of thing together and talking about it and dealing with the challenges that I'll be honest, I had a long time away dealing with UK government or other governments in the US, but I've come back to see a fair bit of renewed vigour in DFAT for this policy, and that's a great thing.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. Very interesting, and particularly the disability side of things. It seems to be that's one of the most difficult pieces, because within communities, as you've said, it tends to be personal experience. Do you see people with a disability being more, how do I say it, targeted so that their voice is heard? And you said it needs more funding. Is that from a high level to filter down to communities, or is that within communities to filter up to government?
Yeah, good questions. And everyone at an NGO conference will say everything needs more funding. We in the small group discussion around that, there was a couple of things that were relatively consistent and had been consistent for CAIMA, I think, in that the inclusion of people with disabilities in our programs had been a little bit coincidental, you know, so we would be working in a community and coincidentally there would be people who were you know, partners in that work that lived with disabilities, and so we hadn't been disaggregating data to the extent that we could have in previous years, and so that's been a change for us. It's also in some jurisdictions there was a bit of it was a change in understanding of what would constitute a disability that you would acknowledge. So we certainly had you know, partners and people who we were working with in countries where they say, well, the fact that that person's missing an arm, it doesn't actually impinge on their ability to, you know, be a community vaccinator particularly, so we didn't mark it down as being a disability. So what is needed, I think, and this is just my view, and it was borne out by a couple of members of the small group I was in, but no, not a great, I wouldn't say there was overwhelming commitment to it, was that targets around disability inclusion, just to set the bar, not, you know, I think there probably are some targets, and there's certainly sort of more monitoring of it, but inclusion in terms of leadership of programs and making sure that they come in at the design phase. So we're working with one of our partners in Malawi who had been planning to build a farmer field school, focusing on particularly small holder livestock. And one of the things we said, it's at the very early stage, we've only just purchased the land. We said, well, let's pivot this to ensure that this is a disability inclusive farmer field school, and actually focus on you know, ensuring that the people from the surrounding communities who are living with disabilities are consulted in the design of the property and the activity. And so we're going out to you know, APDs and working that right into the early stages of the design. That's protracting that design process, and so it needs a bit of you know, understanding from our funders that adds at a level of complexity to it. But in the end, that's a farmer field school that we think is going to stand out from other ones, and we'll be super proud of.
Right.
So yeah.
That sounds great. Thank you very much.
No worries.
Okay, over to you, Wayne. Wayne Gum is Oxfam's Oxfam Australia's Business Development Advisor, Institutional Partnership Manager. He's got 29 years of international development experience, spending 15 years in Southeast Asia, Horn of Africa and South Asia, in numerous roles as an advisor and manager for a range of agencies and programs. And he's worked in Australia with Oxfam since 2010, supporting humanitarian and development programs across the Asia Pacific. So welcome, Wayne.
Great, thanks, Chris. Can you hear me okay? Because I've got rid of my microphone because it doesn't work. Look, I had a presentation, but I think we've sort of superseded it because we've gotten into the meat of things. And I suspect that's what people want to hear more of, is what we really think, than basically repeating what we already heard. And look, I just want to, first of all, say thank you for this opportunity to have a chat with you all, and to echo what my colleague just said. Normally, I'm replacing a couple of my colleagues who were meant to have been here. And normally, you know, I feel quite privileged to be in this space because I know it's not generally, men aren't usually here. But I just want to say it is something that my other colleagues would have been here to present. But just aside from that, again, I'll acknowledge country. I'm in Melbourne, Naarm, which is on Wurundjeri country, but I normally reside in southern Sydney, the other side to where you are, Chris. in Dharawal country, and I see one of our participants is from Larrakia country, which is where I was born. So acknowledge to all elders and emerging and present across the countries, those countries. So just to get to the meat of it, for Oxfam and for me personally, I put in that 29 years, Chris, and I looked at it and I thought, oh my God, I can't believe that. I really can't believe it. But in some ways, it also reflects my thinking on the international development policy. And I think Oxfam is also very welcomes the policy, because I think it's a long time coming, shall we say, since the last white paper about 10 years ago. And I think, to echo my colleagues who have just presented, yes, we agree with all of the above. Really great movement in the right directions. But in some ways, for me personally, I think, it's about time. Let's be honest here, it's about time. We really welcome the emphasis on climate change. But let's not forget, there's been about 10 years of ignoring the issue or pushing that to the back of the agenda. And I'd like to think, and I'm not going to say it's about attribution here, but I like to think all this lobbying that's been going on for quite some time to get it back on the agenda has been successful. And in particular, I'm quite happy with the way we work with the Pacific Islands to really push the Australian government to say, look, you guys are the biggest per capita emitters in the world. We are the most impacted people in the world. Let's sit down and talk about it. So I'm very pleased to see the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister speaking to Pacific Islands about climate change and making it front and centre of new policy. That's fantastic. There's no two ways about it. With regard to the localisation or local-led development agenda, again, that's fantastic. But let's not forget that this is actually fairly standard development policy. Let's be clear here. If people who live in poverty or are affected by an issue are actually consulted and are supported to design the solution, isn't that common sense? That makes it relevant and makes it sustainable. It's a good thing, any way you look at it. In the old days, it was called participatory development. It's called the rights-based approach, but it's common sense. And you've got to ask the question, if you're not doing that, then what are you actually doing? And that's, I think we've alluded to the long road ahead to really define what we mean by locally led development. And I can tell you there was a big discussion the last couple of days in Canberra about that very issue. And it is quite a diverse argument. But I can happily say that, yes, we've been plugging away at this for quite a while. I think, for me, we were talking about this 25 years ago, and it does take a long time to get your mind around it. And a lot of it is about letting go of resources. It's about letting go of power and privilege and really supporting really solid actors in the field, in communities, in countries where we work to lead their own development. It's not a new concept, but nevertheless, we're on the same page. Now it's a matter of how do we do this? And for DFAT, it is about sharing the risk. It's about letting go of resources and putting it in the right place. It's not about just saying we'll pay a high-paid consultant to give advice to government. It's now about, as Rebecca's mentioned, it's how you go about it. It's not just a technical solution. It's about making sure the right actors are in the room. It's a process of negotiation, process of capacity strengthening, but it's also just basically supporting those who are marginalised to be represented. And that's where we hope the new civil society development fund, or whatever they call it, is designed to be just that. Not just giving out money to local organisations, it's giving out money to local organisations that represent interests of those who are marginalised, people with disability, Indigenous peoples, ethnic minorities. Because as we see across the world, particularly in Southeast Asia and also the Pacific, countries and economies are developing, but there are people being left behind. And there's no surprises that it's the same people. It's those of the lower caste in South Asian countries. Often it's women. Often it's people in remote areas, ethnic minorities, indigenous peoples. And I would suggest if we're moving towards First Nation input into international development, it might be exactly that. How do we support the voiceless to have a voice? So I know it's in the design phase and we're eagerly waiting to see how that pans out, but that's fantastic. The concept of development partnership plans, or DPPs, or whatever they're called, that's fantastic. But let's not forget, they were called aid investment plans 10 years ago. And for some reason, they stopped. Now we're going back to what I would call a much more sensible approach. Of course, sit down with your partner governments to discuss what you will do in that country, what you will support, but don't just speak to the government. How about speak to other actors in society, whether it's the private sector, civil society, academics? We got to recognize that every country has a diverse constituencies. It's not just the minister you speak to. So again, I would say that's pretty good practice, but it's nothing new. But nevertheless, we're there. Overall, I think we're moving in the right direction. But I will highlight one point here. There is no real additional funds. At this stage, I think Australia has reached our overseas development assistance of around about 0.21% of our GDP, which compares to the international standard of 0.7%. And that's a pretty low percentage, let's be honest here. But we are really at the lowest we've ever been. And I can show you the graph, and it just goes straight down from left to right. It's like falling down a set of stairs. And we would say that if you're really serious about being a honest a leader in this area, you got to put more money in there, really. And it's a lot to do with being a good citizen in the world, and this is one indicator. So the policy talks about a 2.5% increase every year, which probably in real terms is probably a decrease, but that's a positive. But let's not forget that we're at the lowest area level we've been ever. So move in a positive direction. There's a lot of ground to be made up. The emphasis on gender equity, disability, and social inclusion, I must say that's fantastic. And I think DFAT is to be applauded being a leader in this area, but it's a continuation from before. So I think that's fantastic, but that's actually not new, but it is still positive nevertheless. Well, I'll stop there because I could ramble on for weeks and days, but I'll stop there. And I guess there's any questions.
Thank you, Wayne. I have just a quick question on that funding side. Have you been seeing funding going from aid and development sector into defence or other areas of government activity overseas? Is that something that needs to perhaps be brought back into?
Well, I think sorry to try to rephrase your question. I think it's really about, are the priorities in the right place? And I would say possibly. And that goes back to what was mentioned before about, we're facing some major crises in the world right now, whether it's Gaza right now or whether it's the Horn of Africa. And let's not forget in Central Africa, the situation is diabolical in Chad. You've got more displaced people in Chad than the Rohingya in Bangladesh, which is horrific as it is. Are the resources going there? I really don't know about that. I still think DFAT is still following geopolitical priorities as much as anything in this area. And when I look at where the needs are, where the resources are going, it's clearly not matching. But nevertheless, I can understand the focus on the Asia Pacific. but I do wonder about some of our investments. And I know what you're alluding to, how much of the support in Ukraine, for example, has been taken away from the Overseas Development Assistance portfolio. And I don't know the answer to that, but let's just say there's probably some fancy accounting going on. But I would question in the humanitarian space whether we are really targeting the priorities based on need as opposed to geopolitical imperative.
Mhm.
I think I answered your question.
I think you did. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to open it up for questions from anyone now. If you want to, you can put it in the chat, but please feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question of any or all of our speakers.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you to the three of you, first of all. Wayne, I have to say it's refreshing to hear your point of view. I think that sometimes things are overcooked, and it's whether it's a participatory project, cycle management, but basically we just need to have conversations with people in country, and I think no different to Australia, hop out of the capital cities and go into the areas where people don't have the visibility. I think that's what's incredibly important. From my experience in PNG, Timor and Southern Africa, you don't see people with a disability. So I think it's first of all, it's about working with community to get them out of their, get them visible. And, you know, Anthony, I love the, well, I worked in Malawi and I loved that piece about the school that you're doing. I think that's incredible. I think one of the greatest challenges is actually finding the people who want to be part of the startup. And I think that is where we can learn, is keeping that footprint of that development piece. How do you get their voice? How do you get them to the meetings? How do you actually get them so that all the communication is accessible for them, whatever that could look like? And that, I think, is the information. The end result of the school, magnificent. But that piece, that learning piece of how do we get people round the table and getting community to say, it's okay, bring your person, your sister, whoever it is who has polio or whatever it is to come and participate. So I just wanted to say thank you and just add those comments, and really appreciate the three of you giving up your time, but great to hear your insights, both from the organisational perspective, but also from a personal perspective. So thank you. And thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Tarina. Other question or comments?
Oh, Tarina, just to say, I mean, spot on with the stuff in Malawi. One wonderful team there, wonderful people we work with. You know, stigma around disability is disappointingly prevalent in so many of the markets that we work. But getting that conversation out there and opening your arms extra wide to be welcoming, that's what we're doing, and that's what we continue to try and do. And yeah, it's just staying the course and committing to it.
While you're thinking, I might just share this slide that I have, which came from INDEV, I believe. And this came out directly after the policy was first put out. And it was first impressions of the policy. And I thought it was great to see that for 35% of people, it exceeded expectations. And for nearly 45%, they thought it was not bad, not great. But I thought the best part of this was nobody saw this as missing the mark. And I think that's really, really important. So that was just one that that I saw come out. And I think as time's gone on, it's being seen now as more positive.
Chris, just before we go, I see there's another question there, but I reflected through this process. I wonder, because it's dealing with the development community and we're more inclined to be reflective or do monitoring and evaluation and that sort of thing, do people have more people engaged with publication of Australian policy than many other domestic policies that probably impact their lives more? You don't necessarily get a survey on the new tax policy or an amendment to the Road Transport Act or something. I like the stats too, but I also think as a sector we're engaged in this kind of stuff, which is good.
Indeed. Bardi, over to you.
Hi, Chris. Hi, everyone. Lovely to see you again. My question is around the locally led aspect of the new development policy, and particularly around some of the challenges we've seen from an NGO lens, and now I'm in monitoring evaluation from a consulting side, which is that people kind of tend to rush to the same CSOs in organizations to fill and kind of tick criteria. So how do we kind of go about this so it doesn't become a box ticking exercise and it has the purpose and the intent behind it to actually affect real and meaningful change, particularly when we don't exactly all agree on what locally led development looks like? Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris, I'd like to jump in there, if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
So thanks, Marty. That's an excellent question. And I'll add that during this reflection or learning review in Canberra the last couple of days, this was actually one of the key discussion points. And I think it goes back to the local actors that are supported through locally led development approaches. And I would say that, like anywhere in the world, it's not just about the first people to put their hand up or who the most visible organizations to support. It's about alignment of values as well. And as you know, in Oxfam, we've been doing this for many, many years now, decades, or several decades. You don't just support the biggest organizations around or those who seem to be doing the most. It's those with the value alignment and those that have constituency. So you might find some of those small organizations that represent the interests of the marginalized. And for example, in South Asia, the lower caste peoples, for example, they may not be the most visible organizations, but they do represent a particularly marginalized groups. And I think when you think through those issues in each country and in different thematic areas, and not every country has the same thematic issues, the partners you would work with in some ways self-select. But the big issue here, as you've already alluded to, is the danger of overloading a small number of CSOs or organizations. And that's where I think DFAT has to be very, very astute in how they operationalize this policy. Because there is a fear of mining capacities out of local organizations to fit DFAT programs. And that's a live dynamic happening as we speak. Then there's also the issue of overloading small organizations. You've got to match the resources to capacity. You put too much resources in, you're asking for problems to arise later. So these are the things that have to go into this kind of policy implementation. But yes, a very good question, and that's the heart of the issue.
Mm-hmm. Rebecca or AJ, would you like to make a comment on that too?
Yeah, I also think it's a really good, pertinent question, that, we don't just want to end up all sort of rushing towards the same people. And I think the point that Wayne just made about, the risk of actually trying to, this could be really quite counterproductive. In an ideal world, I think there'd be potentially incentives for programs to work together. And I think the best of DFAT's approaches, provide some support to sort of mainstream things across, and so that they're not each program isn't competing, but there's a certain coherence in terms of the approach, and you can actually build on something that somebody's done in one program and do something else in a program. I mean, it's kind of it's beholden on all of us, I think, to try to do that in this space, and perhaps a key part of that might be the involvement of local organisations in that real-time monitoring, so that if there are issues, that they're sort of holding us to account for those sorts of things. Hey, you've taken all of our staff, or and then we're suddenly required to think about. I mean, hopefully it doesn't get to that, but on that particular issue, but that sort of perverse outcomes that aren't really the ones that are intended, if not sort of positive practices that can be built on and replicated, are identified and sort of acted upon in real time, so that we don't sort of do harm and we do a lot of good. An observation I have, another sort of challenge for us, and a challenge for all of us, right? The community, from DFAT, who are leading the design of programs, through to those of us that are involved in the grassroots. I do hope that what this might do is instead of sort of us focused on organisations in capitals, that we sort of can meet in the course of our work that's often capitals focused, because that's where we sort of live, and that's where a lot of the meetings happen. Whether this might actually push us to sort of get out and engage with a broader range of actors. It strikes me in a country like Papua New Guinea and other parts of the Pacific, that they're heterogeneous cultures. That's their beauty. Their richness is in their diversity, and the diversity of the issues, the diversity of the cultures and languages. And quite often the local actors might be active in a couple of provinces, but not all of them. So hopefully what we'll come up with approaches in which we can share around the engagement between sort of actors, that there's more sort of resources for all that diversity of actors, is what I'm trying to get at here. That a greater number of them can sort of share in the development resource, rather than seeing it sort of captured with those of us that are sort of in front of us in capitals, as I said. I did want to reflect on a further hazard potentially in all of this, which is, I think we need to approach it with a do no harm perspective, because there's all sorts of things that can be done. I've seen, I was posted out in Bougainville, and I've seen the sort of almost jealousy and rivalry that can happen when one organisation becomes the partner and others don't. So again, we want to think about how we're engaging with local organisations, and not just ticking boxes, as Bardi suggested was a risk, and that we're really thinking about strengthening that fabric, that ecosystem of civil society and government, that interplay, that civic space. As Wayne rightly said, that this isn't new thinking, but it's we do need to sort of relearn it and think about new ways of doing it. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to jump in there as well, Chris and Bardi, good question. The localization session at the ANCP Reflections Workshop was great. Kirsten Hawke came in and brought up a lot of thorny issues. We talked a lot about, well, how do you work on localization in let's say a country where the government really hampers the activities of CSOs or cracks down on that. But so there's plenty of discussion around that. One of the things that has kind of stuck in my mind, it's stuck in my craw for a little while. I just want to throw out a scenario. So I think about 12 years ago, I was running a DFAT facility, support facility in I won't say which Pacific country, but it was a reasonable sized Pacific country, and we put together what I felt was a pretty strong team of people from that country who ran the back end operations of that facility in that country. The managing contractor that I worked for lost the contract. It went to another managing contractor, and they hired all of those people, and then eventually they lost that contract, and the next managing contractor came on, and I was chatting to some of those people the other day. They all still work there. They all still work on that facility, and they just have changed their bosses. And it actually really pissed me off, because I wish that I had the insight at the time, or the kind of drive back 10 or 12 years ago to encourage those people to establish their own local services organisation and sell back those services to whichever managing contractor was coming in, build their own share equity in that organisation, and potentially start selling those services to managing contractors outside of DFAT, because that would actually, I think, be a healthier. It's not, okay, it's not specifically locally led development, but it's a healthier way for that community to be able to service donor programs, I think, for their own long-term benefit. But one day you might see that in a bid. One day.
Mhm. Thank you. Kristen, you have your hand up.
Thank you. Excuse me, I'm moving house, so I've been cleaning, so I'm looking a bit hot and sweaty up here.
You look great.
Thanks. I just had a question on sort of more on, I know I absolutely, I really resonated with what you were saying, Wayne, in locally led organisations, and absolute firm believer in that. That's some of the most rewarding work that I've been able to participate in, is that really local led and engagement with the local sectors. I'm currently working on a program, or that's introducing a system into a ministry in Southeast Asia. But one of the things I noticed when trying to look at functional requirements for it was about there was just no one with a disability. So we were looking at what sort of disability, what would we need, or do they have anyone in their departments that we would need to ensure we're able to access the system and have any of those, covered off. And the basic answer for every single department was, we just don't have anyone with disability here, because they wouldn't get the job. And it was really heartbreaking to me, but is there more we can be doing in trying to influence policy, and particularly if we're donating to some of these larger, the World Banks, the ADB, I know there's GEDSI, there's gender elements in the M&E criteria, and it's probably something we don't do particularly well as a country and government as well. But is there more we could be doing to influence policy in these sort of situations?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's worthwhile going back a little bit to when DFAT started talking about disability. That was quite a while ago. And as you I think you're pointing out as well, when you ask around, the answer is always, oh, there's no one with disability here. And one of the first things that a lot of we all do when we do this kind of programming is work with an organisation that represents people with disability. Because the question isn't, are the people with disability? The question is, what do you understand by disability or ability? And once you start asking those kinds of questions, yep, there are people with disability in that community or around. It's more about the social issues that hides them away. And it's, there's all these steps in awareness and then action, etc. So my feeling is that it's not just about the money. It's about the commitment, and of course money's part of that, but there's the commitment to stay in the course. So where you see targets like, oh, you must have 20% disability by this year, I just wonder what you're really talking about there, because it really depends on the context. And we all agree the outcome, but your starting point, it really is variable. And it's got to start from that awareness and then
Yeah.
so forth. And that's what I think is probably the key to it. Over.
Yeah. No, thank you. And it's not so much targets, more, I suppose, even introducing policy or, raising awareness that we do have policies, that we can put policies into place. And to me, that's a starting point for conversations. So, yeah. Thanks, Wayne.
Thank you, Kristen. Another question. No? Okay. Well, let me in that case say a very big thank you to our three speakers. Very much appreciate you being here tonight. Very much appreciate your contribution. I just want to let you know we've had quite a lot of people who are really keen to hear. And so we've got a lot of people who are planning to watch this recording afterwards. So the audience is going to be a lot larger. One of the things that we as an organisation like to do is to say thank you to our speakers, and we say thank you with a fabulous Women in Aid and Development mug, which we will be sending out to you next week. So we really appreciate your time. And of course, we really appreciate that this will sit on your desk and we'll advertise Women in Development to all of your colleagues. So thank you very much. We appreciate all of you coming along tonight. Our next event will be International Women's Day, and we'll be running that the Tuesday before the actual day. And we will focus on I think it's a microfinance topic this year. And so we're already working on our speakers for that event, and you will all receive invitations, and we will look forward to hopefully seeing you at that event too. So thank you, everyone. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Rebecca.
Chris.
Thanks, Wayne.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah,
Thanks,
Anthony.
everyone.
Wayne.
Thank
Thank
you,
Bye.
everyone. Thank you, Chris.
See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wayne and
Fabulous insights. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
You too.
Okay. Thanks a lot.